Okay, so we are continuing with our discussion of termination of marriage. We're going to try and get through as much as I can without me having to pause because I'm coughing. I already had to do that once, so this is take two. So we've talked about disillusion. And remember, a disillusion is when you terminate a marriage, but you do it together. So the husband, wife, spouses jointly petition the court, and then the court says, okay, within 90 days, we'll have a hearing. There are certain required documents that need to be filed with the court. There's the petition itself. There is the waiver of service of process. There is the waiver of counsel if there's only one lawyer involved. There's the separation agreement if there are children. There's a disclosure about where the children have lived over the last 10 years and if Children's Services has been involved with the children, as well as a child support guidelines worksheet. And then there's also a judgment entry that the judge will sign that terminates the marriage. You can bring that to your hearing, but sometimes it's included in the packet. So you've got all of these documents. In some places you file them digitally, some places you take them in person, and you get a hearing date within 90 days. Hopefully, Becky, you've had an opportunity to do the assignments for disillusion by the time you're watching this video, so that you've had a chance to look at a sample packet that the Supreme Court says you have to have, okay? The Ohio Supreme Court actually has samples. They're not one size fits all, but they give you some kind of a format that you can follow, okay? So that's why I wanted you to look at those. One thing that you have to know anytime you are terminating a marriage, and it doesn't matter if it's through a dissolution or an annulment or a divorce, the one thing you have to understand is if there are children involved, the court steps it up. Why is that? Okay, the court really doesn't care about adults. Sorry. If you're adults and you want the court to help you split up your stuff and your debts, great, there are statutes that the court will follow, and that's easy. But if there are children involved, the court maintains jurisdiction over those children until they are 18 or until they graduate from high school. So what's that mean, that the court maintains jurisdiction over them? That means the court keeps tabs on them. The court makes sure there's child support paid. The court makes sure that parental rights are going nicely, visitation is going nicely. The court makes sure there's no abuse or neglect. The court makes sure that those kids make it through to adulthood. So when I say that the court maintains jurisdiction, that's what I mean. They maintain the ability to make orders or have hearings and have orders about those children. So the court takes a specific interest in children where their parents are terminating marriages. And because of that, there are a few steps that parents have to go through before they can terminate their marriage, either with a dissolution or an annulment or a divorce. There are a few things they have to go through before the court will even have a hearing. And so if you're having a dissolution and you want to have that hearing within 90 days, there are some additional steps that you have to take if you have children. And these involve parental workshops, parenting classes. Different courts call them different things. Some call them workshops, some call them classes. But there is recognition by the court that parents who don't like each other, or at least don't agree with each other, might have some issues when it comes to raising children together. Because That's the goal of the court, is to raise the children with as much input from both parents as possible. And so the court says, you know what, we're just going to give you a little reminder, just a little workshop or classes, so that we can impress upon you, number one, that we have jurisdiction over these children until they're emancipated, and number two, because the court doesn't really want you coming and knocking on its door for the next umpteen years saying, they're a terrible mother, they're a terrible father, understanding that there's a reason why you're terminating the marriage. You're not going to agree on everything, but there are ways that you can resolve issues about your children. And by the way, your children didn't pick you, and your children didn't ask for you to terminate the marriage, so how about you leave the kids out of it? Unfortunately, a lot of parents will use their children as pawns against their former spouse, and lots of crazy things happen. And so this is an opportunity for the court, before they even let you terminate the marriage, to say, let's talk about those children for a little bit. Now, these are classes, and sometimes it depends. It depends on the court. It could be one parenting class that you go to for an evening. It could be 3. It could be 5. Every jurisdiction, every county has its own requirements for parental rights and responsibilities, and for parenting classes or workshops. So what do? You go to the court. The court will say you can go to this church, this church, this church, because typically they're at churches. And then once you fulfill our court's requirements for parenting classes, bring us the paperwork that says we've completed it. Usually it's a little completion certificate. And you can file it with the court. And then, if you've done that within the 90-day period before your dissolution hearing is set, then we'll hear it. If not, we don't really care. We're not going to have this dissolution hearing. So you better get it done. Okay? So that is one prerequisite that is in addition to all of the paperwork being filed for the dissolution. But it only applies, again, if you have children. Okay? So that's everything that has to do with dissolution. So let's say that we don't agree. I'm going to cough. Hang on one second. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so that's everything for termination with dissolution, where we agree on everything, and we're going to do this nice. We're not going to litigate against each other. There are 2 other ways that you can terminate a marriage. One is annulment. Annulment is, I call it the Serve Pro way of terminating a marriage, like it never happened. I don't know if you've ever seen those commercials, right? Where after a flood or a disaster, the Serve Pro guys come in and they clean it up, and it's like it never happened. That's an annulment. An annulment is when you tell the court, we have never consummated our marriage. Therefore, we are not really married. And therefore, please make it like it never happened. Now, this sounds really antiquated, doesn't it? This sounds like, are you kidding me? You have to consummate a marriage to be married? Yeah, you do. Marriage, again, is an institution that is designed to have structure for procreation and for a society to move forward. So, if you're married and you have never consummated the marriage, you're not really married. You haven't sealed the deal. Sorry to put it that way. And that's where annulment comes in. Annulment is for those kinds of cases where you haven't consummated the marriage, therefore the court can just say, look, you're not really married. Now, that's been stretched, right? When you think about Britney Spears, you're probably way too young to remember this, but Britney Spears went to Las Vegas once and married a guy and then was like, oops, I didn't really mean to get married to him. And the marriage was annulled. Now, did they consummate the marriage? Oh, I would guess they did. But the court said, wink, wink, nod, nod, no problem. As long as both of you say, never consummated the marriage, we're not really married, we can annul this. It's not really a marriage. Another instance where annulment is used is where you have a foreign arranged marriage, where you have, let's say, two small kids who were married when they were 10. And yes, a lot of cultures do that. Their parents make an arranged marriage so that when they come of age, they'll actually have a really big ceremony and they're married. But in a lot of these cases, the kids are married when they're 10. They come over here to the United States to go to college, and they go to the courts and they say, are you kidding? We're not really married. And the court will say, yeah, we're not going to let 10-year-olds get married. You're not really married. It's annulled. Okay? Or if a woman, typically a woman has been forced to marry someone in another country and they move here, then you can go to the court and say, look, there was never any consent. Again, remember, marriage is a contractual agreement. Just like when we had those limitations on age, right? You have to have capacity. There can't be anybody forcing or coercing anybody to do it. Nobody can trick you. Otherwise, it's not a valid contract. So those same kinds of ideas apply typically when you have a marriage abroad, where typically a girl has been forced to marry someone. They immigrate here, and she says, look, this was never a consensual agreement. We're annulled, right? Because at the very beginning of the contract, we didn't have a meeting of the minds. If we didn't have a meeting of the minds, you can't have a contract. You can't have a marriage. And so it's annulled. It never happened. Okay? That's what I want you to keep in mind whenever I say annulment. It never happened. Okay? What other kinds of cases are there annulments for? Well, the longer you're married, the harder it is to get an annulment. Because the court will do a wink, wink, nod, nod only so long. Right? And then the court will say, just go get a dissolution. Please don't try and ask the court to swallow something that isn't real, and everybody knows it's not real. Okay? So with foreign marriages and with marriages where they haven't been consummated, or another typical, and it's really a wartime example, when men were going off to war, they would get married on the dock before they left to go abroad. They would come back and they'd be like, I don't really even remember you. Sorry. The court would grant annulments in those kinds of cases too. Okay? Now remember, we're talking about legal annulments. There are religious annulments. What do I mean by that? Well, remember, we have two different parts to a marriage. We have the legal and we have the religious. Can you just do the legal? Absolutely. Most people, however, do the legal and the religious. So depending on what religion you are, your faith may require more than a legal proceeding. Your faith may require a religious termination of the marriage. Now, not all faiths do this, but three big ones that do are Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, actually four, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, the Muslim faith, and Judaism. Generally, Protestant faiths don't require this, but the more organized faiths do. So what does that mean? That means that you will have to go through a religious termination of your marriage. Otherwise, in the eyes of your faith, you're still married. Now, why do I bring this up when I talk about annulment? Well, the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox religions speak in terms of annulment. And it has the same kind of meaning as the legal definition of annulment, like it never happened, right? Problem is, if you are getting a religious annulment and you have children, that affects the status of those children. They would then be considered born out of wedlock. And in a lot of faiths, that's a big deal. So I guess what I'm cautioning you about is make sure when you get married, you know this stuff. Not that you want to anticipate that the marriage is going to end, but you better know the rules of the road before you start on the road. I always tell people, if people had a class on terminating marriage and child support and all the other things that come with it, if they looked down that tunnel before they got married, they would be more cautious, a lot more cautious. Because these are stinky things to have to do. And by the way, they cost a lot of money, right? So just because you're doing a termination of your secular legal marriage, depending on what faith you are, you may have to go through a second process that's independent of the legal process in order to be completely out of that marriage. Okay? And again, I bring that up because in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faiths, that religious termination is called an annulment. And again, just because annulment comes from Latin, here's your Latin word of the day. Null means void, never happened. Same thing in the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox, you were never married. And so if you have children, there's an issue. Okay? All right, so that's dissolution to terminate marriage. That's annulment to terminate marriage. You ready for the big one? Here it is. Divorce, the big D, as they call it. This is a real lawsuit, people. This is no fun. This is where you file a lawsuit against the individual that you stood in front of the world to say was the love of your life and the person that you would share everything with, and you were going to live forever and ever, and now you're suing them. Because that's what a divorce is. You're suing your spouse. What do you want out of the lawsuit? Well, it's not criminal. This is not a criminal action. This isn't the state coming in and saying, you're going to jail. No, it doesn't work that way. This is a civil action where the person who files the lawsuit, the spouse that initiates the divorce, is the plaintiff. The spouse that receives the lawsuits called the defendant. Okay? This lawsuit follows basic civil procedure rules. By that I mean, if I file a complaint for divorce against my husband, which I would never do, but if I filed a complaint for divorce against him, all of the legal components for a valid complaint and valid service of process must be followed. Otherwise, it's not a valid complaint. And until he got a copy of it, he was served a copy of it, there's no divorce. It is the same process as any other civil lawsuit. There are initial pleadings where the plaintiff says, we were married. Remember, we have those jurisdictional issues, just like in a petition for dissolution. We were married. We've lived here in excess of 90 days. We have property together. We have children, or maybe not children, together. We have debts. We have real estate. We have bank accounts. We have whatever we have. And we need help, court. Please help us split this stuff up. That's the complaint. Okay? It has to be served on the defendant. I can either have a U.S. Marshal, not a U.S. Marshal, I'm sorry, a sheriff's deputy, or I can have a process server hand deliver it. I can send it certified mail. It has to be done, though. There's no waiver of service of process like in a dissolution, because we're not agreeing. If we were agreeing, I wouldn't be suing you. That's how it works. Okay? Then once my spouse got served, they're going to get mad and they're going to say, I'm suing them. And then there's cross claims. Or, sorry, counterclaim. And they're going to say, well, you want to terminate the marriage? No, I want to terminate the marriage. And it begins. And what makes most people mad when they get a copy of their complaint is the grounds under which the plaintiff is asking for relief. What does that mean? That means, again, I can't just terminate my marriage willy-nilly. There are statutes that say these are the reasons why, or the grounds for granting a termination of your marriage. Now, just like with the dissolution, and they are exactly the same. There can be abuse, neglect, abandonment, and that abuse can be physical or mental. All of those are like, ugh. Adultery, another one, ugh. And then the last one, irreconcilable differences. But if I'm filing a complaint for divorce, I have to include every single one of those reasons in my complaint. Why? Well, because if I can't prove irreconcilable differences, and we'll talk about how we do that, if I can't prove irreconcilable differences, well, then I got to prove one of the others. Adultery, mental physical abuse, abandonment. Okay, I've got to prove that. But if I don't include them in my complaint, I'm out the door. If I only put in my complaint irreconcilable differences, and the court says, I don't think you proved that, then my whole complaint gets thrown out. So you must put every statutory reason that the court can give you a divorce in your complaint. Having said that, most divorces don't end because there's mental or physical abuse or abandonment or adult. Most of them end because someone didn't pick up their socks, right? So let's say I serve, and again, let me make this perfectly clear. I'm never doing this, but let's say that I file for complaint for divorce against my husband. He gets it in the mail and he sees that and says, are you kidding me? This woman is now accusing me for God and the world to see of mental and physical abuse, abandonment, adultery, all this awful stuff. I didn't do anything. I didn't pick up my socks. And then they get mad. And then there's a fight. It just is. This is why, like, when you hear on the news, oh my gosh, so-and-so was accused of abusing their wife, that's why they got a divorce. You know what that means? 9 times out of 10, it means that the person who is supposedly the journalist telling you this story is a moron, because they don't know that that goes into every complaint for divorce. So, be smarter than the average bear. You hear on the news that somebody is accused of beating their wife. That's why they got a divorce. Just chuckle to yourself, because it probably didn't. But it was included in there because a lawyer did their job. If the lawyer doesn't put all of those statutory reasons in the complaint for divorce, they've malpracticed. Because if something happens and you can't prove the irreconcilable differences, then the whole case gets thrown out. So you can't do that. You have to include them all in there. So everybody gets mad when they see that complaint for divorce. That's why we end up with the counterclaim. That's why we end up fighting. As soon as there's service of process, as soon as the counterclaim is answered, there is something called a pre-trial hearing. Now, domestic relations court is a weird place because you're really only going to see the judge at your final hearing. You're going to see what's called a magistrate judge for all of your hearings until that last one. What the heck is a magistrate judge? It's an unelected judge. I hate it. Right? Because that's not the way our system was set up. Our system was set up so that we have accountability with the courts because we elect them. Magistrate judges are appointed by the elected judges to sort of ease the load. So instead of us getting the opportunity to elect another judge, the elected judge sort of gets a patronage position that they can appoint. It's a plum job, and they lessen their workload, and the magistrate judge does all the dirty work. So you're going to meet with a magistrate judge. That doesn't mean magistrates are bad people. I like a lot of the magistrates out there. I just don't like the system. So if I'm in front of a magistrate judge at this first pretrial hearing, it's a big deal. It's a really big hearing. Most lawyers don't prepare for their first pretrial hearing. This is a huge hearing because the magistrate judge is going to put in place what's called temporary orders. Temporary orders only mean temporary until the case is over, until the divorce is final. So from the date of that first pretrial until the judge says you're divorced, these rulings stay in place. And most of the rulings that are in the temporary order end up being permanent for things like who's going to pay for what children, where children are going to live, what the parental visitation plan is going to be, how much child support is going to get paid. All of that gets decided at this first pretrial hearing. Now, again, they're temporary, which means they're in place until the divorce is over, but divorces can take 9, 10, 12 months. And so what the court likes to do is, especially with children, keep things stable. So if things are working nicely, guess what? They're going to continue to work nicely. The next thing that happens at a pretrial hearing is if there are children involved, the court is going to appoint what's called a guardian ad litem. And that guardian ad litem is usually a lawyer who represents the children. What? Yeah, the children get their own lawyer. And if we had more guardian ad litems, then each one of the children would get a separate lawyer. We don't have enough guardians. And so, sorry, the light is pretty bad. Let me try and fix this. Sorry. There, that's a little bit better. Because we don't have enough guardians, the court will appoint one guardian for all of the children, unless there's a problem, and then you come back and you try and fix it. Okay? So a guardian ad litem is a very powerful person because that lawyer is going to make a recommendation to the court about where the children live and what kind of visitation they have. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about parental rights and responsibilities, but understand That's where the guardian gets appointed. So if you are the lawyer and you don't go into that pretrial hearing loaded for bear, knowing who you want your guardian ad litem to be, not letting the court pick, you want to pick, knowing what you want paid by whom as far as bills are concerned, who's going to live where, how much child support is, you better be prepared for that hearing, because a lot of times that is what ends up being the final order in your divorce. Okay? After your pretrial hearing, we have this thing called discovery, where both sides have to make sure the other one's not lying. Make sure, do you have any hidden bank accounts, or what happened to that boat that you parked at your parents' house? You know, there are things that have to be flushed out. Then hopefully you are going to negotiate, the lawyers are going to negotiate and say, okay, you keep this, you keep that, you pay this bill, I keep this bill, this is what I proposed with the children, it seems to be working. And hopefully by the time you get to your final pretrial hearing, which again is in front of the magistrate, you're going to tell the magistrate, we have an agreement. That's called an uncontested divorce, where we started at each other's throats. We've gotten it all out of our system. We agree we're going to have just a final hearing. That happens in the vast majority of divorce cases. People get worn out by the process, or they get a girlfriend or a boyfriend and they want to get it over with. It just happens. So life goes on. And so hopefully by your final pretrial hearing, you tell the magistrate judge, we're done. The magistrate puts it all on the record. You're done. Sometimes you fight about one or two things and the magistrate will say, but you know what? We're gonna agree to what we can agree to, and puts it on the record. And so when it comes time for your final hearing on the divorce, maybe it's only over one or two things. And usually those one or two things are the children. I'm never going to let that boyfriend of my ex-wife's be the substitute father for my children. Or switch the parts around. It becomes tough. Sometimes what the court will do is order you into mediation, or where you have a third party come in and try and get you to the middle so that you can agree. And sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. And if it doesn't work and you're still fighting about it, you have a trial. A real trial, right? With witnesses and the whole thing. And at the end of the trial, you're done. You're done. You're divorced. Now, I will tell you, having done domestic relations law for a really long time, I prefer divorces to dissolutions. You know why? Because at least there's something to fight about. At least there's a little fire in their belly. At least they're invested in the process a little bit. And they're willing to fight a little bit. It's still painful, but it's not the same kind of blah, blah, blah. Oh, we're just kind of every 5 minutes going to terminate a marriage for dissolution hearings. And literally every 15 minutes. On those days where dissolution hearings are scheduled, every 15 minutes a marriage is being terminated. Kind of just blah, blah, blah. Not really much emotion to it. At least with the divorce, there's a little emotion. I don't know. I'm Mediterranean. Maybe that's why I like it. Anyway. Now, your book talks about separation agreements. We're not even going to bother with that. Nobody does that. Okay? All right. I'm going to give you a couple of assignments to go with this. Again, remember, Becky, my textbook will be at the office of the administration building waiting for you so that you will be able to complete all these assignments. Okay? Thanks.